Welcome to Killer Psychologist. I'm Dana Anderson, a forensic psychologist and your host of the show. Killer Psychologist is for true crime fanatics and anyone intrigued with the dark side of psychology. Hi, this is Dr. Anderson, and I have Dr. Craig Wetter here today, and we're going to talk about psychopathy. And we're going to link this to the Lori Vallow trial. A lot of people that have been watching her have been scratching their heads and are trying to understand her, how she got to this point, and how she can just sit there, just detached and void of emotion. Some people are even saying it looks like she's disassociating. She's kind of absent and checked out. Honestly, I haven't been following the trial. I haven't watched the movie Sins of the Mother, but Craig and I, we're going to talk about psychopathy today. And as a forensic psychologist, we assess people like Lori who are on trial for murder, and we can talk about how we might approach this case and what tests we might use on her, because interestingly enough, Lori was found incompetent to stand trial originally, and it looks like she was incompetent for a period of like 10 months, which makes me wonder what was going on, who examined her, what diagnosis did they give her. At some point, somebody had determined that she wasn't competent to proceed to trial and questioned her mental health, maybe believing she had some type of psychotic disorder. As we know, all over in the media, there's a lot of talk about the type of delusional thinking that she had. Craig and I are going to talk about maybe some of the tests we would use and what that might look like. And are there people that can have psychopathy that don't kill people? Honestly, that's come up. And on social media, I saw another psychologist post about psychopathy, saying all people with those traits are bad and never could be trusted, and kind of painted it all as black or white. And I want to kind of dissect that a little bit. And Craig, who does a lot of assessments and assessments on law enforcement, sees some commonalities or common traits between criminals and cops. So, Craig, can there be good psychopathy? Is that even possible?
The short answer is yes. It's more complex, right, in terms of understanding how psychopathy is classified, because, as you know, we don't diagnose psychopathy. We classify it. Now, the DSM-5 TR does have some language that allows us to include within the antisocial personality disorder classification a psychopathy sort of designation now. So that's newer. But in the sense of whether or not someone can possess psychopathic traits that are not harmful to others, I think the answer is yes, that's possible. And we can turn to the business community to see that. We know that in business, psychopathy is actually overrepresented, particularly at the higher levels of executive management, and that would include CEOs and such. I think some of the studies have found, 8 to 10% potentially would meet the criteria, the classification criteria, right, in terms of how we assess it, which some people say, well, that's scary because now we're talking about someone who actually is a psychopath. But I think of psychopathy I think of it dimensionally, just like I think about all personality pathology as being on a continuum where, all of us have little traits, some traits of, for example, a little narcissism or maybe a little histrionic, that kind of stuff. But all the way over on the other end of that spectrum, you've got the disorder, right? Where it becomes disordered, where it's impairing that person's functioning, or it's, impairing their relationships with other people. So psychopathy, I see this the same way. There's a book, I don't recall the author, but it's a great book on psychopathy. It's called Almost a Psychopath. And that book talks about, dark triad traits, but also discusses this whole idea that people, they can have psychopathic traits. And yes, sometimes they can be harmful, but in some cases they could be helpful. And that sounds counterintuitive, right? Because how could that be helpful if you possess traits of psychopathy? Well, when you look in business again, you see competitiveness and you see people, the dog eat dog world sort of, mantra where someone's trying to get ahead and they're screwing other people over to do that. Is that helpful or is that harmful? I don't know. You can make an argument either way, I guess, because it's helpful to that person, right? Because that person becomes successful. But it might be at the expense of other people, right? So now in law enforcement, it's different. Any peace officer that is applying for employment with law enforcement agency, pretty much in all 50 states, they have to go through a pretty comprehensive psychological screening, right? So, and in that screening, we will administer two objective measures. One's a normal personality measure, right? So something like the 16PF or something, or the CPI, and then we'll give an MMPI-3 or 2RF, whatever. What I've noticed, and again, the literature speaks to this, is that you do see elevations in law enforcement candidates generally on what we originally called the psychopathic deviate scale, which was scale 4 on the clinical scales. Now it's RC4, but you typically do see elevations there. That scale is correlated with antisociality and antisocial personality disorder. So by virtue of that relationship, it extends to potentially, some psychopathic traits as well. We don't necessarily disqualify somebody because they have those elevations on that scale, because in some instances, some of the content that makes up that scale has to do with some degree of risk-taking, which you have to be willing to do if you're going to go into law enforcement. There's lots of risk, right, associated with that particular job. So somebody who is risk averse probably isn't going to be a good fit, right? So if they're very low on 4, that might suggest that, they're more risk averse. They're less risk averse, I should say. And that could be a problem. So that's one example of how, those traits can potentially be needed or necessary in some cases, but not too much of it. So there's a balance. There's a fine sort of line. Some people call that the thin blue line, right? Where people who are incarcerated are typically elevated on scale 4 on this, right? So we see those elevations on scale 4, which is that psychopathic deviate scale. And wow, and that's pretty obvious. And then you see, law enforcement candidates can also be elevated as well. And so, this is kind of where that thin blue line, comes in. It's like, well, what separates the criminal from, the peace officer? I think there's a morality piece to that probably differentiates the two. In other words, one breaks the law, one doesn't.
And I've also
generally
seen
break the law.
people that while I test people who are incarcerated, sometimes for competency or other reasons, and I'll give them a full clinical assessment and I'll see certain traits. Sometimes I'll see some antisocial thinking, but not antisocial behaviors. And I think sometimes people think if you're antisocial, and again, not to be confused with I'm not social, it has nothing to do with being social. It's just that type of kind of defiance against society or rules or the law. So some people can think a certain way and not do any crime or not violate the law, but could have just that thinking. And I did an assessment this year. It was a murder, DUI, homicide. So it wasn't purposeful, but I did a diagnosis on this person because it was important. You could think from the outside looking in, oh, this person, criminal behavior, all this stuff, been in prison before, all this stuff. But actually, he had another personality disorder that was kind of unspecified. He was just immature and liked to use drugs and party, but he actually wasn't antisocial. Did it really matter in his evaluation for competency? Not so much, because he was competent. So that was the most important thing. But I think people tend to think all or nothing. If you have antisocial traits, that makes you antisocial personality disorder. Like you're just a law violator. You don't follow the rules, but not necessarily so. And I use this example because this kid that I evaluated, he wasn't antisocial at all. Did he violate the law? Was he in jail? Did he do prison time? Yes, but that doesn't mean, and actually he was outgrowing these behaviors because years have passed and he's changed some of his behaviors. So also I want to say that any clinical assessment is really, you give it and think a year later, someone could be quite different. So it's not a forever. It doesn't, if you tested me when I'm 18 Now I'm this old. That your diagnosis doesn't follow you forever. I think there's a perception if you are diagnosed with something like this, and I've heard it. I'm hearing it on the media for people that are saying someone is high in psychopathy or have antisocial traits, that they can never be trusted. It's all black and white. And I love what you're talking about. I've always said to people, I'm in touch with my antisocial side. I joke about it, but if you are a forensic psychologist and you talk to people about very dark things, you do need to be in tune with like the street world and live there for a little while. Just make sure you can find your way out.
That's the whole institutionalization paradigm where, correctional officers, for example, in prison systems, if they work a number of years in there, can begin to adopt some of this criminogenic sort of thinking just by virtue of being sort of in that institutionalized environment and being around that prison culture, right? So they can adopt some of those traits to some degree just by virtue of being in that system. And I think the same holds true for staff or non-correctional staff, medical staff and support staff and such that work in those settings. So yeah, I mean, obviously, personality is fairly enduring over time, but you make a point about, when you assess a younger defendant who's say 18 or 19, their frontal lobes are not fully developed yet, right? Until probably 25 to 26-ish. And so some of that impulsivity piece, some of the impulsivity and the lack of volitional control over impulsive behavior, you see it, right? In adolescent boys and girls to some extent. Most kids grow out of that, right? Or when they become adults. Some don't. But that's an example of where, some of this is malleable, during those critical development periods. Yeah, I mean, with antisocial personality specifically, like we do know from the research that people age out of this. So, you may have somebody who has been in and out of jail or prison for, decades. By the time they get into their 50s, they begin to age out, meaning that some of those antisocial traits begin to subside to some degree. And potentially that's a consequence just of the aging process generally, but that's what we see. So you're right. Not all personality pathology is like lifelong. And to some degree, some of these disorders are amenable to treatment, not all of them, right? So if you've got an antisocial, someone who clearly meets criteria for antisocial personality disorder, and they have no capacity for guilt or remorse, in other words, you cannot establish that, prognosis is poor for recovery in terms of like any kind of behavior change. It's very difficult to treat those, and that's been established in the literature for a number of years. Now, some people dispute it and say that's not true. Everyone's amenable to change, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's not what the research shows. That's not what the research suggests for folks that have no capacity for guilt or remorse, right? The whole competency issue, too, going back to, if we want to talk about the Vallow case, my understanding was that they committed her for 10 months in this mental health facility. It's likely a state forensic facility, like similar to the facility I work at. Someone that stays that long, committed that long, it suggests that there was a significant barrier to her restorative capacity. In other words, they must have had some difficulty getting her restored so that she could be competent enough to stand trial. In other words, she met the Dusky standard, which is the Supreme Court case that speaks to the issue of competency. So that's an interesting discussion. It's like, well, what was going on there? Obviously, we can't, I can't speculate on diagnoses here because we didn't see her or assess her. But I'm wondering why none of that emerged in the trial. In terms of, it sounds like she didn't put her mental health at issue at trial. In other words, she didn't assert a mental health defense, like not guilty by reason of insanity or guilty but mentally ill, something like that.
Curious who evaluated her and what diagnosis they gave her or diagnoses. So we know there was at least 2 psychologists that evaluated her. And obviously one found her not competent at some point. And then later she's found competent. So this happens a lot. I do competency evaluations typically every week. And so it's pretty routine to evaluate a defendant in custody. I mean, it's part of their rights and due process. They have a right to be evaluated. You want to make sure they do understand what they're being charged with, and can they communicate and work with their attorney. There's not some impairment, and it could be any impairment. They can have dementia. They could have psychosis. They could have delusional disorder. There could be something impairing them. But to be honest, the standard for competency it's pretty low. It's actually presumed you're competent and you can understand. It's pretty easy if you're an adult to understand a little bit about the court. And even if you don't know everything, we can figure out what a judge does, how your attorney is going to help you, what the jury is supposed to do, what your rights are. And you don't have to know everything. Your attorney is going to do it all for you, but you need to work with them rationally and logically. You don't have to be that smart. I've seen some people get through and I'm like, wow, this guy, I don't know how he got through life, but he's here now. And I mean, he's competent, but guys, good luck with this. Poor man, the minimal standard, right?
Well, and it depends too on the severity, right? Like, so, I mean, even though the standards are the same, with the prongs are, do they understand the charges against them? In other words, do they understand what they're being charged with or what they've been charged with? Do they understand basic, legal procedures, court procedure in a courtroom? And that's, like you said, it's just basic, because their attorney can certainly guide them if they don't understand something. It's just, do they have the capacity to learn that information and be able to have an understanding of what the different, roles of folks in the courtroom are, and what and make sure they understand the adversarial nature of the proceedings and all of that. And then the big one, the one that oftentimes that we get, we have difficulty in getting folks over the burden is that third prong, which is the ability to work with the attorney, right? And display a degree of rational understanding of that process. And that's where a lot of times the hang up is, or at least I do 2 to 3 of these a week on average, these evaluations. And this is the one where people get hung up. We just can't get them over that third prong, particularly if they have, any kind of delusional process that intersects the case facts, which it can, delusion being a part of a psychotic disorder, or could be an independent, just delusional disorder as well. Those can be tough. So again, I don't know what happened, what the barrier was in her case. The presumption would be that there was a mental health component of some sort, but it doesn't look like any of that came out. I didn't see any of it in some of the information that I reviewed on the case. But that's likely what was going on, is that there was some barrier around there. There either was a psychotic, something going on that was acting as a barrier on that third prong.
Well, and she definitely held some unusual beliefs, and whether she believed them or not, and she had some religious beliefs, which a lot of people do, and it doesn't necessarily prevent you from being competent. You can have beliefs about the world, God, the devil, things like that, and still be competent. It may not interfere. She reported a lot of unusual beliefs. Were those related to her sort of grandiose sense of self? She was kind of a cult leader herself, like taking on this role, getting others, trying to convince them of these things. She said she wanted money, power, sex. She wanted the power. She loved the attention and the power that it gave her. So whether she really fully believed the extent of this, or this was sort of the lie she told herself, this is what she's told others.
Yeah, I'm also wondering, and again, I don't know if this came out, but so sometimes we get these cases where someone has a sovereign citizen belief system, and I don't know if this emerged in this case, but again, a lot of times what will happen is an evaluator will see somebody and they will have these really distorted beliefs about, like, that they're not subject to the laws because they don't follow the Constitution, because they're sovereign. And so a lot of evaluators think that, well, this is a delusion, right? It's just they're delusional. but that's not necessarily the case. And again, I don't know if that happened here, but it sounded like there were some cult elements to her belief system. And so again, this is speculating, but I'm wondering whether or not that got into and sort of intersected the case itself. Because if there's any intersectionality with like delusions in the case facts, in other words, the sequence of what led up to the crime, then that's a barrier. Generally, it's a barrier. But with sovereign citizen, I'm just an example, someone who has sovereign, if we establish that they're a sovereign citizen, that is an adopted belief system that a sufficient number of people in that community believe in. Therefore, it's not a delusion necessarily. So we don't, if we establish, so if I see somebody that I can clearly see that they're sovereign citizen elements to their, to their personality architecture and the way that their beliefs, I'm not going to necessarily find that as a barrier. Now, I'll put my attorney hat on now and say, well, if I'm the attorney and I'm representing this client, I'm going to have a difficult time working with that person because that individual, they're not going to necessarily agree that they should even have to accept a plea deal or, do anything that the government, right, is trying to impose on them. And so that becomes that problem, that conflict that attorneys will have with people that have some of these belief systems. I've been in challenge hearings, before where this very issue comes up, and the attorney, the defense counsel typically will argue, I can't work with this person because this belief system's interfering with my ability to rationally discuss a plea agreement or a plea deal that's on the table, and I can't, because they're not willing to even entertain. There's no flexibility at all, and so it's this back and forth about, I can't work with them because of this. Well, this is not a mental illness, though. This is not a sovereign citizen belief system. Is not a delusion. That's not how we characterize it. And there's a misunderstanding there. So I'm wondering about that. I'm wondering how that might have played into, or some of this cult stuff may have played into the third prong problem of, her not being able to work with her attorney.
Is someone like that going to be difficult to work with as an attorney? I would definitely imagine so. I mean, they're going to give them a run for their money. I mean, if you're on trial for murder and you're going to try not to be found competent, try to use a mental health defense. This is what people do. And these are people typically that have personality disorders, and they actually are challenging to work with, and they are difficult. I find a lot of defense attorneys raising the question of competency because they're saying, this person won't work with me. They're always arguing. They won't do what I ask. They're just unreasonable. I told them about the plea bargain. I recently had a case. It was like the plea bargain was such a good bargain. It was like less than a year of probation. He could have already been done. But he's just arguing about that for 18 months. I'm like, bro, we are way past. You're expired. I can't believe we're still talking about this. And I found him competent because he was a challenging individual. He had done 18 years in prison, so he knew the game better than me. He told me that. I said,
right,
I believe you, sir. I think you do know the system quite well. You are schooled in it, sir. But you're quite difficult to work with. And I said, I think, and he demanded a jury trial because it's the principal and he can. And also he just had time on his hands.
Yep.
And wanted a pony show and wanted it, even though I'm like, really? But then he insisted, which I said, well, but you understand everything. And I found him competent, and I'm sure, but I put in my report, I didn't say it was going to be easy to work with him, and you're going to find yourself feeling really frustrated because it's really not logical, but this is what he wants. He is demanding a jury trial, even though this is really a waste of time for everyone. But see, he understands the game, and you probably won't have a trial, and you probably will do another plea bargain. And so he gets it, and you kind of got to understand that. So as a mental health professional, I'm trying to explain this to an attorney they see things differently. And yes, is he challenging to work with? just like I'm sure Lori Vallow was going to be purposefully challenging just to try to manipulate things, right? Because she wants to convince them of something else, because that's part of her defense, right? Yeah, I would be curious to see what they diagnosed her as. And I noticed that it wasn't brought up. The defense squashed it for whatever reason. Probably it wasn't very flattering. And I'm guessing if I was the evaluator, I would have assessed her for malingering, which is lying for secondary gain. Lying is self-serving. Everyone lies a little bit. Malingering, lying for secondary gain. That means you might be trying to evade legal responsibility, or people I would see trying to get benefits like SSI. They would pretend to have a mental illness when they're actually just, addicted to drugs. I saw those all the time in the psych hospital. I would do the malingering assessment and they would tell me, I'm here to get a diagnosis. I want SSI. They'd come in high on meth, talk screen positive, and then they didn't even want anything else. They just wanted the diagnosis of schizophrenia. And then they're like, and thank you, I'll be on my way. And I'm like, oh, okay. And so they thought I was dumb. I'd be giving them the assessment and they're just like, so dumb. All these questions are dumb. Endorse every single thing I said. Off the charts,
Everything
100%
off the chart.
malingering.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Have a good day. You will not be collecting that diagnosis on your way out the door. So malingering is so important to assess for, and there are assessments for that. There are certain assessments specifically if someone is lying about having psychosis, right? And there's other assessments where someone tries to lie about memory. So people try different things, and maybe if one angle doesn't work, they'll try another. But I love a good faking psychosis. I do really enjoy that. And I give that assessment. And when people just endorse every single symptom, it's really telling.
Well, they don't know the difference between, the genuine versus the the non-genuine symptoms that are associated with psychosis. It's not as easy as people think. They watch popularized movies about, people who are psychotic, and those are sensationalized and oftentimes do not represent what we actually see in a patient population, right? People with genuine, say, schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder and such. Here's the thing. Now, this is back to the attorney. So I just changed, put my attorney hat on now since practice law as well. If I get the report, the competence, so if I get that competence report back and there's evidence in there that, say, the assessor did testing. Oftentimes competency evaluations don't include formal testing. So let's define that. Formal testing would be giving like an MMPI-3, like a personality psychopathology measure, giving an inventory of legal knowledge as an example of an effort test, right? Giving a structured inventory of malingering symptomology test, which is another type of test, right? That's formal. Most of the competence evaluations don't have formal testing. It's just a semi-structured interview, maybe using the revised competence assessment instrument, or there's others that out there, the MacArthur and such. If I get that back and it shows that, one, there's no clinical diagnosis. In other words, there's no serious mental illness, and the diagnosis is actually antisocial personality disorder, right? I don't want that coming out as the defense attorney. I certainly don't want that to be. I don't want the jury to be hearing this, right? So clearly, like, mental health is not going to be put at issue if that's the case. That's because once you put mental health at issue. So if you assert an affirmative defense like an NGRI, not guilty by reason of insanity, you now have put your mental health at issue, which means both prosecution and defense get to explore that in detail, meaning testing. And then that's where all the experts come in, like us, right? Where we're going to do the formal testing. And if I'm the defense attorney, I certainly don't want to see an MMPI-3 with an off the chart, RC4 and the behavior externalizing scales off the chart, showing that this is an antisocial or potentially psychopathic defendant. That's the worst possible outcome, because what's the jury going to say about that? Oh, okay, so this is not someone with any mental illness. This is a potential psychopath or someone with really strong antisocial personality traits. That's not going to work.
This is why it's so important to have a forensic psychologist that understands this, because in the Lori Vallow case, this is getting, national media attention. And if you did the evaluation, you might be called to the stand, and now everyone's tuned in, listening and wondering what was that conversation like? And you've got to explain what tests you did and why. So a lot of psychologists that do regular clinical work, most of them I know aren't interested in forensics. They're sort of we're kind of a different breed, I think, that work in the forensic population. But you do have to understand deception, malingering. Clinical psychologists I know that don't do forensics, they don't have forensic tests, or they don't have malingering tests, or they don't really know about them or know how to use them. So it's really important, because people can actually get away with murder, and it happens. That's why it is so important, that evaluation, because, as we kind of talked about, there's going to be a fine line between mental illness or personality disorder. It's all on a spectrum. And I'm sure she was many things. She didn't fit neatly into one. She didn't just show up one day and, was high in psychopathy. I think what's more interesting is just the evolving of her character traits, like who she was. I think people always think, again, like I was saying at the beginning, like high in psychopathy or antisocial, like we could just diagnose her, someone could diagnose her with that in the end. It's like, that's actually not that interesting. But more about who she was. She was a woman. She was a mother. She had lots of relationships. She was very sort of histrionic. She's very attention-seeking. Wanted to look pretty,
and wanting to kind of,
very sexualized, very, promiscuous. So she was very self-absorbed, self-centered, some of those things. It seems like she became more narcissistic, kind of this inflated sense of ego, need for admiration, exaggerated self-importance, grandiosity, and then became more manipulative. I think there was at one point when she found out from her son that he was sexually abused by her husband. And I think that was a breaking point for her and if you could imagine it, how that would impact you as a person. It seemed as though she may have just broke off from some of her emotions, like, I will now be using men, or I'm going to get what I want. I'm going to get my needs met. And that's when you saw her starting to exploit relationships, becoming more strategic and deceptive and rationalizing it. All of this is important to understand, because we're seeing more females like this. Not quite like Lori Vallow, but I'm saying, watch out, these traits that I'm talking about, and look at everything that's happening in the world right now with OnlyFans. Women can make millions of dollars doing things and getting attention, getting power, money, sex, get it all. How are they doing that? Well, they're doing it. Not in great ways, not always in legal ways. I'm seeing more and more women going into that, and it's not good. What would one be willing to do? Like, where is that line? Where is the line of morality?
Yeah. So I'm wondering about how, again, the social media, how social media has shifted or changed all of this, right? Where, like you said, get on OnlyFans, they can TikTok, they can do get on all these platforms, become monetized. They start to garner this sense of power, or this sense of control and power, and they get more grandiose as time goes on, more self-absorbed, more ego inflated, right? So I'm wondering how this is shifting or changing the trajectories of mental illness generally. It's, we're seeing increases we're seeing it, the base rates of like mental illness seem to be increasing in a lot of areas just over the past maybe 2 or 3 years. And some of this might be attributed to the pandemic, but I think, we're going to need a lot more time. We're going to a little more research to figure out what's really going on here. But yeah, I agree. I think that we're seeing, and what's interesting is that actually in the forensic hospital I work at, we're seeing more women as well committed than we had, in the past. And that's an interesting trend that is worth looking at. It's absolutely complicated.
Well, and we're seeing the same shift for the men. I watched this video on a divorce attorney the other day, and he was saying the men clients that he is seeing, they aren't working, they're staying at home, they're not doing anything, so they get a role shift.
Role shifts. There's a role shift happening. And I'm wondering if that, so again, testosterone levels in men are also dropping, right? And there's evidence in the research literature that suggests that as well. So that's, put it together. What's going on here? Role shifts. And you're right. We've got a lot of people, a lot of men actually, that are not working right now. So that's it. Yeah, that's very interesting.
One of the things I see is that, so with all this online, you can get anything online. So they're just staying home, watching porn, ordering food, playing video games. Like normally the progression of a relationship, a dating relationship you develop when you're younger, is you go out and meet people. There's a reciprocity, the give and take of a conversation or going out, like you understand. There's trial and error, like you have dating fails, or we all, I had my experiences. So, but now men and women, but they're not doing that. They just buy a pay-per-view. They buy women online. You buy a woman online, OnlyFans. You get them to do whatever you tell them to do. You can feel like you're in a relationship. You can pretend, you can say you're in a relationship. You can, in your head, it's feeding your ego. I've got this person in a bikini. They'll do whatever I want. You're actually not really in a relationship with them. It's fake. So it's sad because what is happening? Like, we're not actually developing these interpersonal skills, and it's not healthy. I just think it's a profound problem from both sides. So women who are prone to be sort of histrionic or, overly sexualized, they can sell themselves online for price, and they're bought. Anyone can do it. You don't have to be even attractive. Okay. Someone will be interested in you, and I've done therapy with clients who do these things. There is a cost associated with this, and we're going to see these consequences. It's very damaging, and it's developing personality disorders.
Yeah, right. So that's one of those variables that's probably contributing to what we're seeing. Just in the explosion and sort of the mental health crisis that we're seeing generally across the country. I do a little therapy as well. And the wait lists right now in all of these platforms, in terms of people all want to do telehealth, right? So everything's all online now. Not everything, but as far as treatment, but majority of people in the country actually prefer to do their psychotherapy now in a telehealth online platform. And, obviously COVID did that or started that, right? And it's continuing to progress. So, I think that all of this is concerning.
Wow.
No doubt.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for your input today, Craig. It's always fascinating to talk to you and have this discussion. Thank you for your input. And anybody that has topics that they would like us to talk about, you guys are welcome to reach out to us. Certain topics or cases that you want us to cover, we'll be happy to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Until next time.
Thanks for listening. Killer Psychologist video episodes are now on YouTube, and you can post your responses there. For episode details and merch, check out Killer Psychologist Podcast psychologydr.com. And for forensic services, you can book online at psychologydr.com. That's psychologydoctor.com.